Welcome to my September essay, Teaching as Art. Teaching movement often feels like a performance, or at least like you're running a rehearsal. It's scary. You never know what's going to happen. It's vulnerable. You can be wrong, you can mess up, and you can feel some pressure to hide those mess ups from your students. It's traditional. There are so many conventions, so much history, so many approaches, and so many different disciplines. The goal of making money can get in the way of focusing on any other goal. Often, we address the fear of failure by leaning on tradition, custom, and convention. There are some differences too. In teaching, the goal is usually pretty clear. In art or performance making, less so. I want to identify some of the principles that I learned about in art and performance making. Did you know that I actually have a BFA in directing? And then I want to use those principles to unpack how I apply them in my teaching, because I really do believe that teaching and learning is an art in a really literal sense. In teaching and learning, everyone is a performer and everyone is the audience. But other than that, there are too many similarities to ignore. If you ask about the difference between art and entertainment or art and craft, people will often say that art is meant to make us think, ask questions, or provide answers in a way that entertainment and craft don't. I don't usually agree with that. I believe that art, craft, and entertainment are all the same thing and that they all provide learning opportunities. For me, the difference is not in the extent to which art, entertainment, or craft can provide opportunities for learning or teaching, but in the extent to which they depart from or comment on established traditions and formulas. Given that the aims of all of them involve the transmission of knowledge, the transmission of sensation, or the transmission of our humanity, why do we create these divides between performance and teaching? Wouldn't some common principles be enlightening? If the transmission of knowledge, experience, and feeling across people and through time is core to what makes us human, then we have lots of ways of accomplishing this. And looking at some of the principles of good art making might suggest some new ways that we can approach our teaching. There is one big difference in how I see art and teaching practiced that I want to tease apart in this essay. In the process of art making and performance making, we recognize that discomfort, open-endedness, and vulnerability are important parts of the process, and we lean in. In teaching, we almost never do this. So, in no particular order, here are a bunch of things I've learned over the years from various teachers, artists, directors, performers, and writers, and how I use them to direct my teaching practice. 1. Move towards discomfort. Growth often happens when you're tangled in the fabric on the floor thinking, could this actually work? In art making, we lean towards these moments of discomfort because the thing that makes them uncomfortable is the same thing that makes them new and exciting. In movement teaching, using a new progression, using a new class format, or teaching in a new style can be uncomfortable in the same way. If we lean towards our discomfort, we also subtly encourage our students to lean into that awkward, shaky place, whether it's trying a new skill or pushing past their usual limits. So when you hesitate or feel uncomfortable, remind yourself that you are letting your students see your discomfort, and that will help them learn to explore their own. Second, question convention and authority. Questioning convention is key in performance making. There are some conventions we observe, some we discard, others that we transform. We examine these conventions, taking the time to evaluate whether or not they work for any particular piece of performance. In movement teaching, this means nudging your students to ask, why do we do it this way? And what if we tried it differently? When they start challenging the status quo, you're not just teaching them a skill anymore. You are giving them permission to create new conventions, rituals, skills, and approaches. Third, your first idea is rarely your best one. Your first idea is like a rough sketch that you doodle on a napkin. It is cute, but you wouldn't hang it up. It's more of a jumping off point, something that you use to get your creative juices flowing. In movement teaching, this is the same. The first way that you teach something should never be the only way that you teach it. You want to refine, tweak, throw it all away, start again until you know the teaching of a skill inside and out. So, when your first attempt at teaching something falls flat, do not worry, that is just your sketch on a napkin. Next, be where you are in the process. When you are making a performance piece, the beginning of the creation process isn't the time to get everything right. It is the time to explore all the options. The middle of a creation process is this time where you start to pick and choose, and the end of a creation process is when you really spend time refining the details of the thing you've chosen. You have to be fully in whichever one of those stages you're at. Don't pick and choose too early, and don't explore a million new options when you're at the end. This is a difference between performance and, say, painting or writing. In fixed mediums, knowing when to stop fidgeting with details is part of the art. But in performance and in teaching, you get to fidget and refine until the final time that you ever perform it or teach it. Teaching is like this. Do not rush your learning as a teacher, and don't rush your students' learning of the things that you're teaching. Build the muscle of knowing which stage of learning is happening, both for you and for your students. The differences between exploration, discernment, and refinement are important, and being fully at the stage that you're in is equally important. Test and retest. Think of actors running a scene over and over, tweaking their tone, their gestures, their timing until it feels just right. They don't settle for the first take. They test different angles, experiment with delivery, refine their performance every time. In movement teaching, the same principle applies. You should be constantly trying out new strategies, adjusting your approach based on what sticks and based on what falls flat. Testing and retesting is about honing in on what works, turning a good scene or a good class into a great one. To make that work, you have to know what you did and what you were trying to do, and be able to repeat things in your teaching that went well and avoid the things that went poorly. Find the right amount of pressure. In art making, the right amount of pressure, whether it's a deadline or the anticipation of an audience, can transform a half-baked idea into a masterpiece. Too little pressure, and you might spend forever fine-tuning something without ever getting it done. Too much pressure, and the joy of creating gets squeezed out. In movement teaching, finding that sweet spot is crucial, not just for your students, but for you. Balancing the pressure from students who are eager to progress and want to learn that new trick from Instagram, and from studio owners who have high expectations or curriculums that they want you to follow exactly. The key is to maintain just enough urgency and pressure to keep everyone motivated, while ensuring that the process stays joyful and creative. Next, a strong structure is invisible, but the absence of structure is not. In storytelling, the strongest structures are solid and supporting, but hidden behind a seamless flow of narrative. When the story unfolds effortlessly, it is because the underlying structure is so well designed that it becomes invisible. In movement teaching, the same principle applies. When your class flows smoothly, it's because the lesson plan is deeply considered. Solid enough to let students relax and feel the flow, but dynamic enough to adjust without feeling chaotic or haphazard. It's only when the structure falters or disappears entirely that its absence is glaringly obvious. Time management doesn't mean being strictly on schedule, but it does mean things like not spending 10 minutes chatting with your students or leading a 20-minute warm-up without noticing. Embrace imperfection. In performance, rough edges and unexpected quirks often lead to the most memorable pieces. Similarly, in teaching, embracing the occasional stumble or imperfect lesson can lead to valuable learning moments and foster a more relaxed creative environment. Recognize, I'm not talking about when your students mess up, I'm talking about when you mess up as a teacher. The idea of a perfect teacher only exists in our heads, while an imperfect teacher is like actually us. It's actually me. It's actually you. Imperfect is the thing that actually exists in the world, and it's much cooler and better to be in the world than in our heads. Create an experimental space. In rehearsal rooms or studios, artists thrive in environments where they feel free to experiment. In teaching, we can applaud and encourage the experimentation of our students rather than their mimicry. This includes everything from giving specific instructions that encourage students to branch out to allowing students to move through the class with their own sense of timing. If one student wants to work on their own, let them. If another student wants to go ahead with a harder variation that they know, let them try that. The more autonomy students have, the more they'll use it. By the same token, give yourself, as the teacher, plenty of autonomy. If you're a studio owner, don't hew your teachers so hard to a curriculum that they feel like they can't experiment. Last principle, get the feedback you need. Getting feedback as an artist can be scary, but it is super important. Just because you're having an experience on stage doesn't mean the audience is having an experience. And so getting regular, trusted feedback is critical. It's the same for teaching. It can be scary to ask for feedback, but getting regular feedback from students and other teachers is as critical for teaching as it is for art making. I was teaching a workshop for emerging artists earlier this year, and one of the people taking the workshop said, "But Adam, you're an artist too. Just tell me what you really think about this piece." And I unhesitatingly answered, "I'm not an artist. I'm a coach." I'm telling this story not to disagree with myself, but my goals aren't the same as a traditional artist's goals, and I don't have opinions about the details of things the way that performers need to. But I do think that my coaching is an art, and I approach every detail of my coaching with the same intentionality, passion, and specificity that artists and performers bring to their work. Maybe that's what this person was picking up on when they asked the question. Because if art is about a process and coaching is also about a process, then my coaching process sure as hell looks a whole lot like an artist's process. If you feel a difference in how you teach and how you create, maybe ask yourself, what is the source of that difference? Why am I making art differently than I'm teaching?